All right, welcome to Integrating Boundaries for the Life You Want. This is the second part of a two-part webinar series on boundaries. If you missed part one last month, you can access a recording of that webinar on our YouTube page. But Women's Advocates, who is bringing you this presentation today, is a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota. We offer a continuum of safety through prevention programming like these webinars, emergency shelter and advocacy services, and housing stability services for victim survivors of domestic violence. We began in the early 1970s as a legal advice helpline that supported particularly women who were seeking divorce and legal name change. And on the helpline, many folks, the legal personnel found that many women were being faced with a crossroads between experiencing violence in their home or being homeless on the streets, either with themselves or with their children, and wanted to create a third option for people who were in this situation. In 1974, we had our first night of emergency shelter for survivors, and in the almost 50 years since, we have expanded our shelters 3 connected homes now, and our mission statement has been updated to better reflect what it is we do, which is walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. You can learn more about us on our website, wadvocates.org.
It's also important to us to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on. So I'm going ahead and reading our land acknowledgement. So Women's Advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. You can also learn more and read our full acknowledgement at this link to our website that I just put in the chat.
Thanks, Brenison, for reading that. We are going to start with a quick 90-second poll just to figure out what's bringing you here today. What are you seeking to learn from our time together? Today's training is divided in 3 parts. First, we're going to look at some practical tools for identifying our boundaries. Next, we will talk about how boundaries relate to embodiment and how setting healthy boundaries can empower us. And finally, we're going to learn how to communicate those new boundaries with other people and how to navigate their responses. As always, take care of yourselves however you need to during and after this webinar, because everybody's impacted differently by engaging in these sorts of conversations. So take care of yourselves. Without further ado, let's get into it. Part 1, we're going to start with a refresher first. What are boundaries and what can they look like? All right, thanks for participating in that poll, everybody. I'm going to end it now. All right, so what exactly are boundaries? Simply put, boundaries describe what is and isn't okay. They are ways to communicate acceptable and unacceptable behaviors and relationships to say, hey, this is all right for you to do, this is not all right for you to do. The purpose of boundaries, what they really do for us is they help us engage in healthy and safe relationships. And by healthy and safe, we mean relationships that are respectful, that are authentic to who we are and what we want, and are considerate. Again, a little refresher from our part 1 webinar in August. There are 6 major types of boundaries. There are sexual, material, time, physical, intellectual, and emotional boundaries. You might also have digital boundaries, meaning limits on how often you use certain apps or who you engage with over text versus over the phone. And we have a quick little affirmation here that my ability to set boundaries is about having the courage to love myself, even when I risk disappointing others. The courage to love myself, even when I risk disappointing others. And then again, boundaries of each type can fit into 3 categories. They can be strict, they can be healthy, they can be lenient. Strict boundaries are those with very little wiggle room, while lenient boundaries might be so permissive that they stop resembling a boundary at all. Rigid or strict boundaries are those that keep others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection or to avoid being judged. People with strict boundaries have a harder time opening up or being vulnerable with other people. They may think that they have to have the same set of boundaries for everybody. Whereas people with lenient boundaries tend to overshare. They don't have that same problem of not being vulnerable. They are overly vulnerable with everybody. And those folks, again, their boundaries might be so permissive that they stop even being effective as boundaries. All right. One tool that you might implement in your boundary journey is to set values-driven boundaries. We are going to add a values worksheet to the chat that has all of these values that are listed on the screen on them. And you can identify your top 3 values using the worksheet and then plug them into the Mentimeter word cloud that is also on the screen so we can see the values of this group. So I am going to stop sharing this screen and start sharing the values presentation screen. Just a moment. All right, let's see what everybody's boundaries look like. All right. All right, what are our top 3 values? Go ahead and plug those in. Plug those in from the Mentimeter, and we'll see what people's values are. When we are thinking about setting boundaries that are driven by our values, like what does that look like? Well, for example, if one of your values is anti-racism, maybe you set a boundary with yourself and with others, similar to, well, if somebody that I am around, if somebody that I'm sharing a space with says something that is racist or perpetuates racism, my boundary is that I'm going to make it clear that that is unacceptable and ask that they stop. That's an example of a boundary driven by the value of anti-racism. So you can set a lot of different boundaries based on your values. Okay, we have a couple of folks saying that they value belonging, peace, growth, equity and inclusion. These are all great values. And if you can't get Mentimeter to work, you can feel free to add those top 3 values of yours in the chat. We would love to see that in the chat as well. I'll just give folks a little bit more time to plug those values in. All right, well, thank you all for doing that little activity with us. Let's get back to it, shall we? All right. So another useful tool to identify our boundaries is the Healthy Mind Platter. And this was created by David Brock and Daniel Siegel, sort of as an emotional equivalent to the government's like food pyramid plate. The Healthy Mind Platter describes the 7 different kinds of time that human beings need to experience every day in order to feel our best. So to feel our best, our brains need focus time. They need time to focus on tasks in a way that is goal oriented. We need time to take on challenges, and that makes deep new connections in the brain. We also need playtime. We need time to be spontaneous and creative, to enjoy new experiences. We also need connecting time, connecting with other people, ideally in person, but webinars are fine too. And we need time to appreciate our connection to nature and to the people around us. We also need physical time. We need time to be active and move our bodies, and that helps strengthen our brain as well. We need time to reflect internally, to think about our feelings and thoughts and focus on our sensations. And that helps us integrate our brains. We also need downtime. We need time where we're not focusing on anything at all. We don't have any specific goals. We just get to let our minds wander. And that helps our brains recharge. And then we also need sleep time. We need time to give our brains the rest that they need, to process all of the information that we learn during a day. So you can identify boundaries that will help you access all of these different kinds of time. So let's take a poll. What kind of time do you need more of? I'll go ahead and let you answer that. What kind of time do you need more of all of these? All right, I'm just going to take a moment and let these results roll in. And with everybody coming in, everybody's results in, it looks like we need more sleep and connecting time. I hope we all get that. Let's think about, as we think about identifying our boundaries in these next couple slides, think about what boundaries can you set with people in your life to get more of this kind of time, to get more sleep time or connecting time. Great. Thank you, everybody. So we've outlined our values. Yes, I am sharing my screen. Good. We've outlined our values. We've established what kind of time we need or what kind of time we want more of. How do we access that time? How do we access that time? How do we access the values that we want to enact in our life? Well, we do that by setting boundaries with the people in our lives. So we access more time for the things that we want to do, or for the values that we want to live by, or for things that make us feel good by setting boundaries. And that access to more time happens in 2 ways. So the first way is by saying no. We can free up spots on our calendar by saying stuff like, no, I can't help you move on Tuesday. Absolutely, we can do that. But when we set boundaries and clarify our needs with people up front, before Tuesday comes around and you're supposed to be helping this person move, we free up more time that we otherwise might have spent worrying or fretting over the state of our relationships. So these next couple slides, we're going to go a bit more in depth on setting boundaries with folks in each of these areas and figure out how to free up our physical and emotional calendars to get more time for the life that we want. So let's talk about boundaries with family real quick. Family means your parents, in-laws, siblings, extended relations, people you're co-parenting with. And a lot of times setting boundaries with family can be really fraught because there are such long-held patterns there. For a lot of people, family is the central socializing institution. And your family's culture, your family's way of doing things can be learned when you grow up as an unshakable rule. As like, this is the way it is, it's always going to be that way, you cannot change it and shouldn't want to. If we realize as adults that there are parts of our family's way of doing things that don't work for us anymore, it can feel like we're turning everything we've ever known upside down. And it can also seem like when we reject those specific ways of doing things, it can also seem like we're rejecting the whole family when really we're not. We're just saying, I want to do this one thing differently, or the way that we're doing this doesn't work for me anymore. I want something to change, but not everything, right? So when you're thinking about setting boundaries with your family, you might be trying to address the changing dynamics that happen as we grow and as we form new lives and new connections. Um, I'm thinking about changing dynamics, particularly with parents. So as we grow and make that switch to from child to adult child of your parents, that's a really tough transition, right? And it requires negotiating new boundaries. But even with other relatives, like even with cousins or aunts and uncles, grandparents, there is a long history of you fitting into an established role. And boundaries are really helpful for you to say, like, I'm not that person anymore. I want to break out of this established role. Um, Boundaries with family, like such as where you're staying during the holidays, or how many family events you want to attend, or how much you share with people about your lives. Those can be really fraught because there is just so much history there. Like if you grew up in your family, these people have known you forever. And it's really easy for the little things to snowball over time if we're not setting boundaries right away or in the moment. You don't have to have big conversations about these roles changing. You can practice boundaries in the moment, and we'll talk more about how to do that in these next couple of slides and in the rest of the presentation. But practicing boundaries with family is the difference between saying something like, hey, I don't eat meat anymore. Could you leave the chicken off my salad? And oh, you put the chicken on my salad. You never listen to me. You think I'm the same person that I was when I was 8. Like, boundaries are the difference between those two things. The first request is a simple request that a reasonable and boundary honoring family member can accommodate right away, saying, like, hey, could you leave the chicken off of my salad? That's a simple request that somebody can and should respond to affirmatively right away. But the second one, saying like, you never listen to me, you think I'm the same person, like that's not even a request. It's an accusation. And there's not really anything that can be done about it, right? Like you can't go back in time and change the way that you've treated people. And it's not a request. So I say all that to say that boundaries are things that we can implement in the moment, and that kind of keeps us from snowballing into those big blow ups or those big arguments. So when you're thinking about setting boundaries with family, think about like, what do you value in your relationships with them? What do you want out of those relationships with your family, and how do you want to be treated? Okay. As we're thinking about boundaries to implement with family, here are some examples. Um, Feel free to put your own in the chat. It would be really cool if we could all talk about what boundaries we want to implement with our family members. Some examples are, I'm not going to play mediator in any arguments between my parent and my sibling. I think people should talk to each other about their disagreements. You can set that boundary. You can also say, hey, before you stop by for a visit, I would like you to call me. Um, you can make simple requests like that. And you can also say, hey, I need some time to myself. I'll get in touch with you when I'm ready to talk again, but right now I need to be alone. All of these excellent boundaries that you can have with your family that you can implement and should implement if you feel the need to. So if you are able to add some boundaries in the chat that you might want to implement with your family, feel free to do so. All right. But we're going to move on to work boundaries. In pursuit of the work-life balance, boundaries at work are about finding a balance between work, who you are at work and what you do at work, with who you want to be outside of work, right? And there are some things that make setting boundaries at work challenging, and the biggest one is capitalism. Like, we need money to survive, yes, and our ability to make that money is contingent on how well we perform or conform to the environment that we're working in. So we might think that our work boundaries have to be super negotiable, super lenient maybe, or non-existent, out of fear that we'll be fired if we stick to them, or that we'll face professional consequences if we stick to them. Know that this is not true. You get to have boundaries at work. You do, and you should. So when you're thinking about professional boundaries, you might be thinking about your workload and how many extra projects that you take on without additional pay. You might also be thinking about how to interact with coworkers who gossip or who overshare. But you might also not even know where to begin setting boundaries at work, which is fine too. That's why we're here. And so if you are one of those people who says, I know I need to set boundaries at work, I have no idea where to start, I offer you this question. What boundaries could you implement that would help you think less about work when you're not there? That would help you think less about work when you're not there? Because that's really the crux of the matter, is like, you don't want to think about work when you're not getting paid to think about work, right? And thinking about work when you're not at work means you're not thinking about the rest of your life when you're living it. So what boundaries could you implement that would help you think less about your work while you're not actually at work? Think about it. Let that question lead you to the boundaries that are going to be helpful to you in your professional life. Oh, somebody in the chat saying they've had to set boundaries with their sisters, doing so by unfriending on Facebook. That is super valid. You can always press that unfriend button. And then somebody about boundaries at work, not downloading the email app on their phone and setting do not disturb on the hours that you're at work. That is a great boundary. Way to go, everybody. So let's talk about setting boundaries with our friends and with our romantic partners. This could mean boundaries around how much time we spend together as a couple or as a unit. Versus how much time we spend on our own, doing our own thing. There could be boundaries around money, around who's paying for what. If you're in a relationship with somebody for a while, maybe do we share accounts? Do we have our finances combined? Those sorts of boundaries. Another boundary you could consider implementing with friends and romantic partners is that simple question of, do you want advice or do you want me to listen? Establishing in the moment or in the conversation whether this person that you're talking to and care about wants you just to listen and be kind of a sympathetic ear, or whether they want you to start strategizing for them. Because getting that wrong can be really fraught sometimes if somebody wants you to listen and not offer advice, but you haven't actually been told that they want you to listen, and you start offering advice, that conversation can sour pretty quickly. You can also ask yourself, when you're thinking about the boundaries you might want to implement with friends and family, You can ask, which relationships feed my soul? Like, who do I want more time with? And who drains me? Who do I really need to establish some boundaries with so that they're not draining my energy as much? How do I want to be treated by my partners, by my friends? And then another question to ask is, how much can I give this person? How much of my energy, how much of my time and presence can I give this person without compromising myself, without compromising the other kinds of time that I need more of, without compromising my values, my sanity, my sleep time. But there is something that makes it challenging to set boundaries with friends and partners, is the worry that setting boundaries mid-relationship will disturb or disrupt the dynamic. You might think like, man, I've been dating this person for 5 years, or I've been friends with this person for 5 years. I didn't set a boundary at the beginning. Sorry about that. You might think like, man, I didn't set a boundary when we first got together. And now I can't, it's too late. It's too late for me to set a boundary. No, it's not too late. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. You do not have to, you don't have to just not have boundaries because you didn't set them way at the beginning of the relationship. You can always set a boundary. It's okay. You can do it now. So here's a list of personalized relationship rights. Maybe this list of relationship rights will help you develop boundaries of your own with people that you are friends with or that you're dating or married to. In your relationship, you always have the right to time alone, time with other people. You have the right to say no without apology or explanation. You have a right to bring up what bothers you. In all of your relationships, you have all of these rights and more. Are there any other relationship rights that you can think of that you have the right to blankety blank in your relationships? Please let us know in the chat. And while we're thinking of those, I will say, the things that you have a right to in relationship, looking at this list of relationship rights can help you think about, I know I have a right to time alone, but I don't really get a lot of time alone in my relationship. Maybe I will set a boundary saying like, hey, can you not hover over me while I am on my phone? I want to just not have anybody looking over my shoulder. Or, hey, I'm going to spend time with my friends, and yeah, it would be cool if you came sometimes, but other times I just want to hang out with my friends without you. So I'm going to tell you, hey, this is something that I'm going to go to alone. That is another boundary that you can set based on your relationship rights. Somebody says the right to ask for what I need without feeling guilt. Absolutely. In any relationship that you have the right to ask for something that you need. You don't have to feel guilty about asking for it because you need it. Why would you feel guilty about asking for a need? You don't need to. All right. Thank you all. Let's talk about boundaries we set with ourselves too. It's so important to be accountable to yourself when you're doing boundary work. It is important to have hard limits on what we put our own bodies and our own hearts through. Self-boundaries are really difficult, but they're necessary for everybody. But they can be particularly difficult, and they're particularly worthy of attention for survivors of abuse who've been taught to ignore and violate their own boundaries over time. So some examples of boundaries you can set with yourself are things like checking your calendar before you say yes to stuff so that you don't accidentally overbook yourself. I do that all the time. I say, well, I violate that boundary with myself all the time. I say, yes, I can totally do that. And then I check my calendar and realize I have no time to do that. And I have to go back and say, no, actually, sorry, I can't. I overbooked myself. So now what I have started to do is establish this boundary with myself. I've started to check my calendar, take the time to say, hey, I would love to do this. Let me check my calendar and get back to you. And I really do. It's really cut down on my ability to overbook myself, which is great. So that's an example of a boundary that you can set with yourself. But other questions when you think about setting boundaries with yourself are, how do you want to treat yourself? Are there limits on the things that you will, the words that you will use with yourself? How will you allow yourself to speak to yourself or to speak about yourself? Will you meet yourself with cruelty or with kindness? Those are some questions that can lead to boundaries that you set with yourself. And then again, another question that you can ask is, if I cross my boundary, if I am the one who violates the boundary that I've set with myself, how am I going to react? Am I going to react with gentle accountability, saying like, oh, I crossed my boundary there. I'm going to do better next time. Apologize to me, self. Or are you going to shame yourself for it? I would recommend giving yourself grace and being your own friend, as somebody says in the chat. Absolutely. That is a great boundary that you can set. So those are all boundaries you can set with yourself. Just to offer you some examples there, feel free to write your own and put it in the chat. We would love to hear it. But we're going to practice writing some boundaries now. So take a little bit of time and think of a boundary that you need to establish with somebody. Anybody. It can be yourself. It can be with a parent, a friend, a supervisor, and write that boundary using an I statement. So you saying something like, I want blank, I need blank, I would like or I expect blank. Just write it down and don't explain it. Don't say I want blank because blah, 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 blah. Don't write the word because anywhere in your sentence. And definitely don't apologize for saying I want or I need blank. Go ahead and write that out. Share it in the chat if you would like. This is a safe environment for you to practice writing those boundaries in. We know that communicating a boundary to somebody can be really stressful and really intimidating. So practicing writing our boundaries in spaces like this can make the actual experience of communicating it less mystifying, less stressful. You can think of this activity space as kind of a beta test where you can write a first draft of your boundary that just simply states the thing, that just says, here's what I want, or here's what I need. We are going to talk more in part 3 of this webinar about polishing these statements and actually communicating them with people. But for now, just be writing, I want, or I need, I would expect, I would like, or I expect. Just take a couple more seconds to think about those, write those down. I'm still thinking about what somebody said in the chat. I will give myself grace and I will be my own friend. That's a great boundary to have with yourself. And that way, if you find yourself saying, being hard on yourself or treating yourself the way you would not treat a friend, you can still give yourself grace and say, we're being a little harsh on ourselves, aren't we? Yes, someone says, I want to be kinder to myself and treat myself to goodies. Yeah, you deserve goodies. I want to be kinder to myself is a great start. And we'll talk more in part 3 of the webinar about communicating a boundary, like what does being kinder to yourself mean? How to communicate those boundaries. So if you don't just have boundaries with yourself, then you have boundaries with other people. How do you make those boundaries known to those other people? We'll talk about that in part 3. But if you're having trouble with this, if you're having trouble identifying the boundaries that you need, or if you've identified a boundary, but the thought of communicating it to anybody just sends your shoulders up to your ears, there are ways to start baby steps, to practice baby steps to implementing the boundaries that you've identified. You can do things like correct people if they get your name wrong and say, oh no, it's Mary Beth actually, not Mary Jo. You can tell a restaurant like, hey, I asked for my burger medium and I got it well done. Can you please fix it? Advocate for yourself in those little ways, in those low risk situations, because people are going to honor them. Like if you're in line at Starbucks and the barista gets your name wrong and you say, oh, this is not correct, my name is actually blank, that barista is going to correct themselves. And that restaurant is going to correct your order. So when people honor those boundaries, like when the barista or when the restaurant honors those corrections and requests, you get internal feedback, you get your belief reinforced that your boundaries will be honored and that they can be honored. I think part of the reason that so many people are afraid to set boundaries or to communicate their needs is that they're afraid that somebody's going to say no, or that somebody's not going to honor their boundaries. But the more we practice setting boundaries in real life and have those boundaries respected, the more we learn that, oh man, I can do this without incident. I can set boundaries. I deserve to ask for what I need, and I'm more often than not, I'm going to get it. So that's all to say. You can identify boundaries that help you engage in healthy, respectful relationships with your friends, with your family, with your coworkers, romantic partners, and with yourself. I'm going to turn it over to Brenison now to talk about part 2, boundaries and embodiment and empowerment.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. So we have been talking a lot about what boundaries are and the role they can play in our lives. I also want to introduce the idea that boundaries can be a conduit for embodiment and empowerment, and how being able to set healthy boundaries can be healing for people who have experienced control, abuse, trauma, or other sources of boundary violations. I really like this definition of embodiment by Prentice Hemphill. Embodiment is the awareness of our body's sensations, habits, and the beliefs that inform them. Embodiment requires the ability to feel and allow the body's emotions. This embodied awareness is necessary to realign what we do with what we believe. That last part of this definition really stands out to me, since that is what is often compromised when our boundaries are violated or when we feel we aren't allowed to set them in the first place. Not feeling able to create effective change in our own lives due to fear of judgment, retaliation, abandonment, and a host of many other things can lead to us feeling misaligned with our values and to feel disembodied. I'm going to put a link in the chat really quick just to Prentice Hemphill's website on embodiment if you want to learn more. We've also talked a lot about the different types of boundaries. Mary Beth did a wonderful job of doing that. digital, emotional, physical, time, all of these, and also the different categories that we can think of them as lenient, strict, and healthy. But boundary setting can also be an embodiment tool. And so Deb Grant talks about the difference between bonding and defensive boundaries. She says that bonding boundaries are when we are fully embodied and we're not under physical threat. And so our expression of our moment-to-moment boundaries, so some of the things Mary Beth was talking about, can come from a place of choice about bonding and connection, rather than from a seemingly choiceless place of defense. So setting boundaries can then become interesting, enjoyable, and creative. She also talks about the idea of defensive boundaries, of how when we are fully embodied and under physical threat, our body's defense system is more readily available to organize internally for the best possible outcome for survival. So she talks about how, if you think of martial artists who have training that allow them to be at ease in situations that might otherwise produce great tension or dis-ease for others. And then another really important component of this embodiment piece is being able to read other people's boundaries and being able to respect them as well. So our embodiment also creates in ourselves a greater ease with reading the signals that other people are putting out, regardless of whether those signals are clear and organized, or maybe they're unclear and disorganized. Our capacity to see that and to feel others' relationships to the space within themselves and around them becomes more refined and also informs our own interactive, interpersonal, and environmental choices. And then she also talks about how it is essential for us to support the development of our ability to have a strong and natural attunement to our internally oriented sense perceptions. So through these senses, we register the signals arising from our own body systems. These signals enable us to determine desire and aversion, bonding and defending, and yes and no, to produce appropriate motor responses to these signals to avoid feelings of self-betrayal, which we've talked about before too, of being able to honor boundaries with ourselves internally. And so now that we've learned a bit more about the role of embodiment and boundary setting, I'm going to launch a related poll. So this question is, which of the following statements do you agree with? So there are 5 different statements. One is, I regularly tune into my body, and if something doesn't feel right, I don't do it. Another is, I respond to requests asked of me before pausing and checking in with my body. I feel aware of other people's body language and it informs how I act around them. I find that I don't always pick up on other people's social cues. And I find myself doing things even though I know I don't want to. One that I really resonate with and something that I'm actively working on is working to respond to pause before responding, right? So if someone asks something of me and says, oh, Bredesen, can you do this? My immediate response is usually yes. And I really hone in on the can. So I think about if I physically can, if my schedule and my time literally allows me to, rather than do I want to? Does this feel aligned with how I want to spend my time during that day in the week? I don't often pause and check in of like, how does that request feel for me? And it isn't until later where I've already said yes and committed where I realize, oh man, I really shouldn't have done that. Or I wish that I wouldn't have. And so it does grow either resentment or have that feeling of self-betrayal, and being able to turn back and change your mind can be more challenging too. So it can help you avoid that if you're able to take a pause and lean in. All right, I'm going to share the results. So it looks like a lot of us are relating to being able to feel other people's body language and that informing how you act around them, and also being able to regularly tune into your body. And if something doesn't feel right, you don't do it. So that's great. Sounds like a lot of you have already been engaging in embodiment practices as it relates to choices and the ways that you show up with others. I'm also going to include the link to Deb Grant's website if you're interested in learning more about the way that she thinks about embodiment and boundaries. All right. So the kinds of boundaries that we set can also be informed by our emotional regulation system. So compassion-focused therapy, or CFT, builds upon evolutionary ideas about human brain function. So Paul Gilbert argues that the human brain is a product of evolution and that our thoughts, emotions, motivations, and behaviors can be understood in terms of the advantages these ways of thinking, feeling, and acting posed for the people who came before us, for our ancestors. And so the model proposes human beings have a tripartite motivational system, which is sometimes referred to as the emotional regulation system, with different systems which can be conceptualized as mindsets. So people can be in the states of threat with a mindset focused on seeking protection from dangers. If our threat system is overactive, which it oftentimes is for people who've experienced interpersonal trauma, that's when experiencing joy can be really scary, because that might mean our guard is down and something bad can happen because we're not on high alert. And then another system, drive, refers to a mindset attuned toward wanting, seeking, aspiring, or striving. Some survivors might really lean into that and identify as recovering overachievers or recovering perfectionists, or people who are kind of trying to distract themselves from their own emotions by being driven toward certain accomplishments and goals, which isn't inherently bad in itself, but it's when all these systems aren't working together where we might feel dysregulated. And then soothing can refer to a mindset focused to giving and receiving care, affecting, and nurturance. And so what's really important about this is healthy functioning of the soothing system is necessary for self-soothing. So without it, we can be really prone to self-criticism, self-attack, and shame. And so this model thinks about dysfunction being a result of limited flexibility or overuse of one system to the detriment of others. And so a less functional or less active soothing system can often be a result of trauma, neglect, or inadequate opportunities to learn soothing from important caregivers or people that we have formed attachment with at a young age. So CFT, or compassion-focused therapy, uses this tripartite motivational model as a foundation and encourages people to develop a more compassionate mindset, which can be really useful when engaging in boundary setting. And so now that we've kind of learned more about the emotional regulation system, we can think about how it informs our boundary setting with another poll. So the question is, which of the three systems do you think will most motivate or inform your boundary setting? So the drive system could be reflected as my boundaries will promote my value of productivity and allow me to do the things I say that I will do. Another approach could be my boundaries will protect me from others' negative energy or overwhelming expectations. And then another could be a soothing system of saying my boundaries will focus on time for self-care and feeling connected to people who care about me. I'm also going to include a link to more information about the emotional regulation system if you are curious about that. So I'll give one more moment for people to reflect and think about what system informs their boundary setting, or that they want to inform their boundary setting moving forward. All right, great. I will go ahead and end the poll. So it looks like a large percentage of us are saying that the drive system is what informs their boundary setting. And then we have a couple others in the other categories as well. So thank you for sharing that. I hope that that was a useful practice to kind of start thinking about our emotion regulation system and how it informs the way that we show up with ourselves and with others. So setting boundaries can also be thought of as a tool for empowerment. And we use that word a lot, empowerment, in the advocacy world. And I really like Lisa Goodman's empowerment process model, which describes the process of building empowerment as an iterative one, in which a person who lacks power or has had it taken away from them sets personally meaningful goal-oriented toward increasing power, takes action, and makes progress toward that goal. And so that draws on this person's evolving self-efficacy, knowledge, skills, and community resources, which you'll see is located in the center of the circle on the diagram there, and observes and reflects on the impact of their actions. And so if you were to read this article, it talks a lot about how empowerment is a process involving multiple steps and an evolving sense of what is needed and what is possible, depending on the impact of that person's actions. And so at any point within this process, it would be possible to ask about the outcome of the efforts of saying, how empowered is the survivor or that person at that time? So feeling the ability to set and maintain boundaries can contribute to that sense and that feeling of empowerment. And so they talk about empowerment being a bridge concept. It crosses the boundary between self and the social world. So being able to say yes and no and have it mean something in the context of a relationship or a system can be a really powerful thing, because oftentimes that ability to say yes or no is taken away by an abusive person or system. And so being able to have that can be a way of reclaiming power. And Goodman also talks about how an increase in power is an increase in one's influence in social relations at any level of human interaction, from dyadic, so like between two people interactions, to the interaction between a person and a system. So many survivors are people who have had power taken from them, don't feel able to set boundaries, or have had very negative consequences for trying to do so. So you can apply all of those different components, the self-efficacy, the skills, knowledge, and community resources, to being able to set boundaries and work toward empowerment through that. So I would really encourage you to read more on this idea of the empowerment process model, especially if that is something that you are working towards with folks in your own healing journey as well, but also if you're within the advocacy realm. So I went ahead and put that link in the chat. So practices of empowerment and embodiment, as we just talked about in the previous slides, can improve our relationships. And on the screen are some tips from the book Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Glover Talab. And she talks a lot about these mindful relationship habits and how we can think about practicing empowerment embodiment through these different questions and through these different considerations. I'll also include this link to this 40-minute YouTube video where she talks about boundaries in relationships if you're interested in learning more. And then lastly, for the second section, just to talk a little bit about how sometimes friendships can get lost in these conversations about meaningful relationships. But we know that friendships can often provide a safe, secure base for us to practice setting healthy boundaries. So many of us may be fortunate to have what Aminatou, I think that's how it's pronounced, and Anne, called big friendships. So you'll see the key components that they consider to make up big friendships and nourishing our big friendships can get pushed aside or not prioritized when we are in unhealthy or abusive romantic relationships. So refocusing and pouring into these friendships can be a practice of empowerment and embodiment in itself. And so think about if there's a friend in your life that you would like to reconnect with and deepen that friendship in meaningful ways that are aligned with your goals and values for the person that you are and the person that you want to be. And so you'll see some of the components if you want to start nurturing big friendships are kind of being able to have that reciprocal piece. I think that's a big one for people who have experienced harm or unhealthy or abusive behaviors from other relationships and even friendships. Friends can absolutely use abusive behaviors. And so being able to think more about that reciprocal nature and thinking about how it can transcend life phases, geography, and emotional shifts as well, of that person being someone that grounds you, someone that is able to be there through the thin and the thick of it all. And so being able to reconnect to those friendships can be an important part of this conversation too. And so we try to have this be a holistic conversation about how boundary setting can apply to all of the relationships in our life, whether that's in a professional setting or a personal setting as well.
Thanks, Brenison. So we have identified our boundaries in part one. We found some empowerment in the fact that we get to have them in part two. And now we got to spread the word, right? How do we tell people about our boundaries, and what do we do when they respond to us? Let's talk about that. I have a group activity here, another mentee meter that that Brenison's just put in the chat. You can contribute to the word cloud. We want to know what feelings come up for you when you think about communicating a boundary with somebody you know. Maybe think back to that I want, I need thing that we just did earlier. How do you feel in your body when you think about telling the person that you wrote that for that you need that boundary? There are some suggestions for feelings in the feelings wheel that Brenison just put in the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing real quick and then start sharing the word cloud so we can see what folks are actually thinking about and how we're feeling. So feelings that are coming up for us when we're thinking about communicating a boundary with people we know. Oh, we're feeling some fear, some guilt and shame, anxiety, nervousness, vulnerable, absolutely. Vulnerability is a key component of boundaries. And it's also really hard to be vulnerable with somebody, to say like, hey, I'm coming to you from this place of need. I need, or I want, or I expect this thing or this action. Sharing that need or want with someone who has the power to say, yes, I can give you that, or no, I cannot, or I don't want to. That's a vulnerable position to be in. Absolutely. Some folks feel resentment when they're thinking about communicating a boundary. Absolutely, especially if you've had to repeatedly say, or you've had to reinforce this boundary with somebody umpteen times. Yeah, you can feel a lot of resentment there. Like, why didn't you just get it the first time? Why do I have to keep telling you this over and over again? Absolutely. All of these are valid feelings to be coming up for you when we're thinking about establishing or communicating boundaries. Yeah, being true to yourself. I love that. That's a very positive feeling that that you can feel when you're setting a boundary or when you're thinking about setting a boundary. Because yeah, setting a boundary allows you to be true to yourself, to say, hey, in order to really enjoy my life or really enjoy this relationship, this is what I need. And asking for what you need in that way is a way to be true to yourself. I love that. Way to go, everybody. So let's go back to our presentation. You can continue adding all of that stuff on the word cloud if you'd like, but let's talk about communicating boundaries. This next tip is so important that it gets its own slide. People will not guess my needs. I know you're all on mute, but you can repeat after me. People will not guess my needs. No matter how obvious you think you've been, no matter how long you've known each other or how many times you've hinted that you have this need, people are not going to guess it. Even if you want them to, even if you really wish that they would just guess what you need so that you didn't have to tell them, it's not going to happen. People are not going to guess your needs, which means that you have to state them. You have to communicate your needs to people. And that sounds really scary. That's when all those feelings from the word cloud about like anxiety, guilt, shame, that sounds really scary, particularly for people with interpersonal trauma in their backgrounds. It can be really nerve-wracking to even begin to state a need to someone or to communicate a boundary. It's also hard for people who maybe they don't have trauma in their backgrounds, but they were raised to deny their needs, or they were taught to deny or ignore their needs. But the thing is, the hardest part of setting boundaries is that for the boundary to work, you actually have to communicate it. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to communicate our boundaries, and it's going to be okay. Like, you can do this. It's going to be okay. So deep breath. Let's talk about communicating our boundaries. Even if you haven't communicated boundaries, you probably have them. Like, you probably have stuff that you wish people in your life would do differently, or maybe you wish they would do less of around you. Or maybe you have pet peeves in your relationship that you haven't verbalized, but you get really annoyed or resentful when they make an appearance. Those are boundaries. So let's take a breath and prepare ourselves for communicating our boundaries to others. First, we have to figure out what method is going to be the most effective. What communication method? Is it going to be over text or in person? Or am I going to communicate this boundary over the phone? Note that choose an effective method is the language we used, not choose the method that's going to be the most comfortable or the least uncomfortable for me, because communicating a boundary is going to be uncomfortable. Like, there's no way around that at first. But the method of communication that you choose is going to depend on your physical safety with this person, like whether you're physically safe being in person with them and saying, I have this boundary that I need you to respect. It's going to depend on whether you know them to be somebody who is respectful and caring, who's going to be a good listener and will allow you to speak your whole piece without interruption. If when you're thinking about communicating a boundary to this person, if you expect them to be to interrupt you, to get really angry, to question you unfairly about why you dare to have this need or boundary, maybe text or email is the best way. But the method of communication that you choose is going to depend on your safety, how you believe this person or how you know this person to have responded to boundaries in the past, your physical proximity to this person. And maybe you can't have an in-person conversation because they live all the way across the country, and then you do have to do text or email. So all of that to say, choose an effective method. And then when you do communicate a boundary, try to do it in the moment. So if somebody interrupts you, say like, oh, hey, I wasn't finished talking. That's a totally fine thing to say. That's a totally fine way to communicate a boundary, to say like, I wasn't finished talking. But if they continue to interrupt you, then you can have a larger conversation about that pattern of interrupting you, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next couple slides. But another way to communicate your boundaries is to name drop this presentation. It is totally normal to tell a friend or a loved one, like, hey, I was in this webinar the other day. It really got me thinking about my boundaries, how I talk about them with others. Are there any you want to share with me? I have a couple that I would like to share with you. You can make it a conversation. And that way it doesn't have to be like a big, scary, I am coming to you with what I need. It can start out connectively by saying like, hey, I want to share with you this part of my life or this experience I just had. And I want to talk to you about all the things that got me thinking about. And then it's also important to know that like just one conversation or just one instance of setting a boundary might not be effective because we're human, we're going to forget stuff. The people you set boundaries with are going to forget the first couple of times. So it's important to have multiple conversations to reinforce the idea that yes, these boundaries exist and yes, they're important to me. So here's how to set and communicate your boundaries. We did the work in part 1 of this webinar to identify and define our boundaries, to figure out what boundaries do I want to set with my family, my friends, my coworkers, my partners, myself. We did all of that work. So step 1 is done. We've defined the boundaries, but now we have to communicate it to the person, right? Because you can't set a boundary with somebody in your mind only and not communicate it to them and then be upset when they cross it. Like that's not healthy behavior. You have to tell the person what you need. You have to say, I do not want to be yelled at. I want to be spoken to at a respectful volume. You can't just think in your mind, oh man, I wish they wouldn't yell at me. You have to tell them. And then when you're communicating your boundary, you can stay simple. You don't need to explain every detail of why you're setting it or what caused you to need it. And you for sure don't need to apologize for it. Keep it simple. Say, I want to be spoken to in a respectful volume. I don't want to be yelled at. You don't need to say, I don't want to be yelled at because it blah, 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 blah. No, just say, I don't want to be yelled at. I want to be spoken to in a respectful volume. And then once you've clearly and simply stated that boundary and you haven't apologized for it, you can say why it's important. You can set consequences without over-explaining or apologizing. You can say, I need you to speak to me at a respectful volume. I need you not to yell at me. This is the boundary that I am setting in order for us to have to continue our relationship. Or you can say, if this boundary is crossed, I'm going to hang up the phone. Those are fine examples of step 4, set consequences. And then finally, be consistent. Again, not everybody is going to remember your boundaries right away. And unfortunately, not everybody is going to respect them right away. People might see what they can get away with or try to test your boundaries to see if you really mean it. So you have to show them you're serious by following through. If you've said, do not raise your voice at me, if you start to yell, I'm going to end our conversation, you have to be prepared to end the conversation if they start to yell. We have to be consistent and enforce boundaries every time because we have to train others to respect us. And we also have to train ourselves that we're worthy of that respect. And then, as we mentioned, again, Brennison in the chat saying that applies to people you feel safe with. If you don't feel safe, if the person is abusive, it's not physically safe for you to set a boundary. So we're not going to get upset with you, and you shouldn't get upset with you for not setting boundaries with people who are not physically safe to set boundaries with. It's the abusive person's responsibility to choose healthier behaviors and to become a person that you feel safe and comfortable setting boundaries with. So if you're not safe, if you're not physically safe, don't worry about it. Don't worry about setting boundaries. Just focus on your physical safety. But as we mentioned in part 1 of the series in August, we talked about how boundaries are not demands. Setting a boundary does not mean telling somebody what to do. This graphic from the holistic psychologist kind of outlines the difference between what is a boundary and what is not a boundary. So saying stuff like, I'm not a superhero. I can't do everything. What don't you understand about that? Like, that's not a boundary because it doesn't give a specific, I need this from you, or consequence. The bottom line, the line underneath that is a boundary to say, going forward, I won't be able to have dinner ready on Fridays with my schedule. That says, I don't have the time. I can't do this. It clearly establishes that I'm not going to make dinner on Fridays. I don't have the time. So again, setting a boundary does not mean telling somebody what to do. What is really happening when we set a boundary is that we are naming the behavior that this person is doing and how we feel as a result of that behavior. And then we're letting them know how we'll respond if that behavior happens again. So saying, when you yell at me, I feel disrespected. Going forward, I need to be spoken to in a respectful tone, or I'm going to end the conversation. Great boundary. So just because you've identified a boundary doesn't mean that everybody's going to know about it, or even that everybody's going to respect it. The nature of being human means that sometimes well-meaning people are going to do stuff that rubs up against our boundaries. Boundary crossings happen. We have to figure out how to respond. So here are some examples on the screen of boundary crossings. I would love to know, what do you normally do in response to these boundary crossings like these? If somebody were to corner you at a party and not stop talking to you, how do you handle that situation? If somebody stands uncomfortably close to you and doesn't notice when you back away, like, what do you normally do? How do you normally respond? All right, give folks a couple more moments to answer the poll. A lot of times there are several options for how you can handle a boundary crossing. You can say, that's not okay, you got to stop. You might just ignore it and act like it's not happening. Others of us may bottle up our discomfort. They may say nothing and nothing and nothing, and then finally they can't take it anymore, and there's an explosion. You may take the indirect route and do nothing in the moment, or not address it to this specific boundary crossing person, and you may go complain about them to other people later. Those are other options for how you might handle a boundary crosser. But I'm going to end the poll, and it's looking like most folks in response to a boundary crossing they go direct. They tell them it's not okay and that their behavior needs to stop. Way to go. That's very direct. It is also, it's hard to be direct sometimes, especially when you have a history of ignoring your own needs and ignoring your own boundaries. It can feel insurmountable to tell somebody straight up, no, this is not okay. You have to stop. But that is something that we can strive for, that we can work towards. So we talked a little bit about how we feel when we think about communicating boundaries, but how do we feel in those moments when our boundaries are crossed? We might be frustrated or angry. We might feel shame or guilt or embarrassment. We might even regret having identified or communicated the boundary in the first place. All of these are super valid feelings to have when your boundaries are crossed. What you do with them, however, well, what you do with them is up to you. But let's talk about how we might address boundary violations or boundary crossings. First, we want to take a moment to figure out, how do you feel? When your boundary is crossed, if you can notice that a boundary crossing is happening in the moment, like if you told somebody, hey, don't yell at me, speak to me respectfully, and they do start yelling at you, if you can catch that in the moment and take a minute to figure out, how do you feel? Are you feeling fear or regret or shame in this moment while this person is yelling at you or crossing that boundary? So take that moment, self regulate, get your breathing together, take your time. Take your time, figure out how you feel, and kind of get to a point where you can address this behavior. When you're elevated, when you're in fear or in crisis, you can't comfortably address a boundary crossing. So try to get yourself to a point where you can comfortably address that crossing. And then name the behavior to the boundary crosser and request a change. Say something like, hey, you're standing awfully close to me, please back up. Or you're yelling, please use a lower volume when you're speaking to me. So name that behavior and also accompany your naming of that behavior with a request. And then follow through. So you can say, please use a lower volume when speaking to me. Remember when I said, if you continue to yell, I'm going to leave. And then if they continue to yell, you follow through. You follow through with the consequence that you set when you communicated your boundary. So if that means you leave the room, you leave the room. And then later on, you can circle back with this person. You can say, hey, so let's talk about when you yelled at me again and I left the room. Again, I didn't leave the room because I don't like you. I left the room because I need my boundaries to be respected, and I'm not going to continue to engage with somebody who yells at me. So in the future, can you agree to speak to me in a respectful volume? You can circle back afterward. You don't have to have that big conversation right away in the moment. In the moment, you just have to name the behavior. And again, this graphic is a circle because we are going to have to continue bringing it up. Boundary violations are going to continue to happen. And we're going to have to continue this process with different people, with different boundaries, all through our lives. But it's important to be persistent and consistent because we need people to know how best to show up for us and how best to treat us. However, we can't control how people are going to respond to us when we communicate our boundaries. We unfortunately can't make it so that everybody says, oh, wow, Mary Beth, that's a great idea. Going forward, I'll make sure to do that. We can't magic our way into that. Sometimes people are going to respond to our boundaries in ways that make us feel uncomfortable or confused or angry. And while we can't control how they respond, we can control how we respond to their response. There are a couple common reactions to boundary setting, like resistance, ignoring, and guilt tripping. So here are some ways to handle them so that you feel prepared to continue setting boundaries. Sometimes people's negative responses to our setting boundaries can make us feel like, oh man, I shouldn't even have done this in the first place. But don't let that get to you. It's important to continue setting boundaries. You might meet with resistance from people when you set boundaries. You might have somebody that says, are you sure you want this? Like, are you really sure you want me to do this? I don't think this is super fair. I don't want to. All of those are examples of resistance. And you can address that by acknowledging that, like, yeah, it's new for me too. I hear you. I hear your discomfort. But this is my decision and it's the right one for me. Because they can't argue with that. There are some people who are going to ignore your boundaries, who are going to continue acting as if you've never communicated the boundary because they want to know if you're serious. They hope that if they just act like they never heard it or that you never had that conversation, you won't remind them and they'll get to keep doing what they've been doing. So you address that. You address people ignoring your boundaries by saying, hey, remember when I mentioned that boundary? That's still very much the case. that boundary still exists. So please respect it, and make sure to do it right away. Address it in the moment. And then you have guilt tripping. You might have people who say like, oh, you set this boundary, you must hate me. Like, oh, I must be a terrible person if you meant that I had to set this boundary. And so what you can say to that is, this is what is healthiest for me. And I'd be very grateful for your support. It's not because I hate you, it's because this is what's healthiest for me. And I want to continue our relationship. So those are some ways that you can respond to people who respond to your boundaries. But our last note is about how other people in our lives can set boundaries with us. It's really important to keep an open mind and be respectful of other people who are expressing their boundaries to us, because we want them to respect our boundaries when we set them and communicate them, right? But if we learned early in life that boundaries are a punishment or a negative consequence, it can be easy to think like, oh man, what did I do wrong to cause this boundary? But instead of thinking, oh man, what did I do to make this person set a boundary? I propose a mindset shift. So maybe instead of viewing boundaries as a reactive punishment, try looking at them as a gift. They're an invitation for further connection and investment in the relationship. So this person probably isn't setting a boundary because they hate you or because they don't want to hang out with you anymore. They're setting a boundary because they want a relationship with you. And that boundary is needed to maintain that relationship. So think about it like that. If somebody's never set a healthy boundary with us before, like if we're new to people setting boundaries with us, we might be unsure about how to respond. So on the screen are some examples of verbal responses to somebody setting a boundary with us. Stuff like, thanks for letting me know. I'll do my best to honor that. Or what you're asking is different from what I'm used to, but I want to respect you. So think about how people in your lives might have asserted boundaries with you, and how do you respond? How do you want to respond to people when they express boundaries to you or when they communicate their boundaries to you? And then finally, we have our boundary setting affirmations. You don't have to be boundaryless to be loved. It's okay to say no and to feel good about saying no. How people treat you is their decision, and how you react is yours. You can access more of those affirmations at the link that Brendan put in the chat. But thank you all for being here today. Ending domestic violence takes all of us. It includes choosing healthy boundaries and healthy behaviors over abusive ones, shifting the culture away from victim blaming and towards affirmation and belief, holding people who use abusive actions accountable for changing their behavior, and modeling, educating, and discussing healthy relationship dynamics, including boundaries. So thank you for doing that last part with us today. We have plenty of resources available for you on boundaries and on everything else. If you could take a moment to fill out our quick survey on boundaries, we have the link in the chat here. And then yes, we will we'll send the slide deck out so you can see what you missed. We'll have the recording online. Quick plug before we end, though, that Women's Advocates Online Survivor Support Group starts back up in October. So please fill out that interest form in the chat by September 26th so we can get folks into our support group. Know that we offer pop-up advocacy in the community on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then finally, here's that link to download the slide deck, to receive a certificate of attendance, to get in touch with us on our monthly listserv or on our events page. Thank you all so much for being here. I am going to stop our recording now and